The winter wind howled through the streets of Tombstone, Arizona, like a banshee seeking vengeance, carrying with it the bitter promise of a harsh night ahead. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that clung to the wooden buildings and accumulated in the doorways of the notorious mining town that had seen more blood than most battlefields. Samuel Carter rode hard through the gathering dusk, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of 42 years of hardship, loss, and the kind of loneliness that settles into a man's bones like winter cold. The cattle drive had finished 3 weeks early, and the extra money in his saddlebags felt like a promise of better times ahead. He'd been gone for 4 months this time, longer than ever before, but the thought of surprising his 3 boys had driven him to push through the treacherous mountain passes despite the approaching storm. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." Sam's horse Thunder picked his way carefully through the icy streets, past the Oriental Saloon where piano music and raucous laughter spilled out into the night, past the Birdcage Theater where painted ladies beckoned from frost-covered windows. Tombstone never slept, but tonight even the hardiest souls seemed to be seeking shelter from the brutal cold. As Sam approached the modest wooden house on the outskirts of town that he called home, his heart quickened with anticipation. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows, painting rectangles of gold on the snow-covered ground. Everything looked peaceful, welcoming, exactly as he'd imagined it during those long, lonely nights on the trail. But as Thunder's hooves crunched through the deepening snow, Sam's smile faded into a frown of confusion and growing alarm. 3 small figures huddled against the front door of his house, pressed together like frightened animals seeking warmth. Even in the dim light, he recognized them immediately. Eli Carter, his eldest at 12 years old, sat with his back against the door, his arms wrapped around his 2 younger brothers. Ben Carter, 9 years old and always the most spirited of the 3, was shivering violently despite being sandwiched between his brothers. Little Tommy Carter, barely 6 years old, had his face buried against Eli's chest, his small body racked with tremors from the cold. Sam's blood turned to ice as he realized his sons were locked outside in the freezing night, wearing nothing but thin cotton shirts and worn trousers that offered no protection against the brutal Arizona winter. Their lips were blue, their faces pale as death, and frost had begun to form on their hair and eyebrows. He dismounted Thunder with the speed of a man possessed, his boots sliding on the icy ground as he rushed toward his children. The boys looked up at his approach, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock, relief, and something else that made Sam's heart clench with dread, fear. Tommy was the first to move, launching himself into his father's arms with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of his small soul. The boy's skin was like ice, his tiny hands numb and clumsy as he clutched at Sam's coat. Eli and Ben followed more slowly, their movements stiff and awkward from the cold, but their eyes never left their father's face. Sam gathered all 3 boys against his chest, feeling the violent tremors that shook their small bodies. They'd been out here for hours, he realized with growing horror. In weather like this, they could have frozen to death. The front door of the house opened with a sharp crack that echoed through the night air. Margaret Carter stepped onto the porch, her silhouette framed by the warm light from inside. She was a handsome woman of 35, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and cold blue eyes that seemed to take in the scene before her with complete indifference. Margaret had been Sam's wife for 2 years now, a marriage born more of necessity than love after his first wife, Mary, had died of consumption. The boys had needed a mother, and Margaret had needed the security that marriage to a successful cattleman could provide. It had seemed like a practical arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. But looking at his sons' frightened faces and their stepmother's cold expression, Sam began to understand that he'd made a terrible mistake. Margaret's voice carried clearly across the frozen yard. each word sharp as a blade. She explained that the boys had been disobedient, that they'd refused to do their chores, and had been disrespectful to her authority. Children needed to learn consequences, she said, her tone as emotionless as if she were discussing the weather. A few hours in the cold would teach them proper respect. Sam's hands clenched into fists as he listened to her justifications. He'd seen men freeze to death in weather like this. He'd watched strong cowboys succumb to hypothermia in less time than his sons had been locked outside. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted to care for his children, had nearly killed them through her cruelty. But as Sam looked more closely at his sons, he began to notice other things that made his blood boil with rage. Eli's left eye was swollen and discolored, the mark of a recent blow. Ben had finger-shaped bruises on his thin arms. Tommy's shirt was torn, and there were welts on his back visible through the rips in the fabric. This wasn't the first time Margaret had hurt his children. The evidence was written on their bodies, in their frightened eyes, in the way they flinched when she spoke. How long had this been going on? How long had his sons been suffering while he was away on cattle drives, trusting their stepmother to care for them? Margaret's explanation continued, her voice growing sharper as she detailed the boys' supposed crimes. They'd tracked mud through her clean house. They'd been too loud during her afternoon rest. They'd questioned her authority when she'd ordered them to go without supper. Each transgression seemed more trivial than the last, but Margaret spoke of them as if they were capital offenses. Sam's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. These weren't the actions of a woman disciplining unruly children. This was systematic abuse, deliberate cruelty designed to break his son's spirits. And the worst part was that he'd been blind to it, too focused on providing for his family to see what was happening right under his own roof. The boys remained silent throughout Margaret's recitation, their eyes downcast and their bodies tense with fear. They'd learned not to defend themselves, Sam realized. They'd been trained through pain and intimidation to accept whatever punishment their stepmother chose to inflict. As Margaret finished her explanation and turned to go back inside, expecting Sam to simply accept her version of events, something inside him snapped. The loneliness that had driven him to marry this woman, the desperate need to provide his sons with a mother figure, the willingness to overlook small cruelties in the name of family stability, all of it crumbled in the face of his children's suffering. Sam's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but filled with a dangerous edge that made Margaret pause in the doorway. He told her to pack her things and be gone by morning. He told her that if he ever saw her near his sons again, she'd regret it for the rest of her very short life. Margaret's mask of cold indifference finally slipped, revealing the calculating mind beneath. She reminded Sam that she was his legal wife, that she had rights under territorial law. She pointed out that he was gone for months at a time, that the boys needed supervision and discipline in his absence. She suggested that perhaps Sam wasn't fit to be a father if he couldn't see that his children required a firm hand, but her words fell on deaf ears. Sam was already lifting Tommy into his arms, the boy's small body still shaking with cold and fear. He told Eli and Ben to get inside, to warm themselves by the fire while he dealt with their stepmother. The boys obeyed quickly, their relief at being allowed back into the warmth of their own home heartbreaking to witness. As Sam carried Tommy toward the house, the boy whispered something that made his father's blood run cold. Tommy told him about the nights when Margaret would lock them in the root cellar for hours at a time. He spoke of the meals they'd been forced to skip, the beatings they'd endured, the constant fear that had become their daily reality. But it was Tommy's final whispered confession that truly shattered Sam's heart. The boy told him that they'd stopped believing their father would ever come home to save them. They'd thought he'd abandoned them forever, left them to suffer at the hands of a woman who seemed to take pleasure in their pain. Inside the warm house, Sam tended to his sons with the gentle care of a man who'd learned too late the true cost of his absence. He wrapped them in blankets, prepared hot soup to warm their chilled bodies, and examined their injuries with growing fury. Each bruise, each welt, each mark of abuse was like a dagger to his heart. As the boys gradually warmed up and began to talk more freely, the full scope of Margaret's cruelty became clear. She'd been systematically breaking them down, using physical punishment and psychological torture to maintain control. She'd told them that their father didn't love them, that he'd sent her to discipline them because he was tired of dealing with troublesome children. The lies had been almost as damaging as the physical abuse. The boys had begun to believe that they deserved the treatment they received, that they were somehow fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love. It would take time, patience, and all of Sam's determination to undo the damage that had been done to their young minds. But even as Sam comforted his sons and planned for Margaret's departure, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. There had been something in Margaret's eyes when he'd ordered her to leave, a cold calculation that suggested she had no intention of simply walking away from the life she'd built in Tombstone. As the wind continued to howl outside and the snow piled higher against the windows, Sam held his sons close and wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows of his seemingly peaceful home. The cattle drive money in his saddlebags suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the wealth he'd nearly lost through his own blindness and neglect. The lonely cowboy had returned home to find that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from the harsh wilderness or dangerous outlaws, but from the people we trust most to protect what we hold dear. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds that hung over Tombstone like a gray shroud, casting the snow-covered town in an eerie half-light that seemed to match Sam Carter's dark mood. He'd spent the night sitting vigil over his sons, watching them sleep fitfully in their own beds for the first time in months, their small bodies finally warm, but their dreams still haunted by the trauma they'd endured. Margaret had vanished sometime during the night, taking only a small bag of personal belongings and leaving behind no trace of where she might have gone. Sam had expected her to put up more of a fight, to use her legal status as his wife to complicate matters. But her silent departure only increased his suspicions that there was more to this situation than simple domestic cruelty. As the boys slowly awakened and began to move around the house with the cautious steps of children who'd learned to expect punishment for the smallest infractions, Sam made breakfast and tried to piece together the timeline of events that had led to this moment. The more he learned about Margaret's behavior during his absence, the more convinced he became that her actions had been part of some larger plan. Eli, the eldest and most observant of the three boys, provided the most disturbing details. He spoke quietly while his younger brothers ate their first full meal in days, describing how Margaret had gradually isolated them from the rest of the community. She'd stopped allowing them to attend school, claiming they were needed for chores around the house. She'd forbidden them from playing with other children, saying that the Carter boys were too good to associate with the rough elements of Tombstone. Most troubling of all, Margaret had been asking strange questions about Sam's business dealings, his cattle routes, and the locations where he kept his money. She'd shown particular interest in his plans for expanding the ranch and his connections with other cattlemen throughout the territory. At the time, the boys had assumed she was simply trying to understand their father's work, but now Sam recognized the questions for what they really were: intelligence gathering. Ben, despite his youth, had noticed other disturbing patterns. Margaret had been receiving visitors during Sam's absence, men who came to the house late at night and spoke in hushed tones about matters the boys weren't allowed to overhear. She'd also been making frequent trips into town, often returning with packages and letters that she kept hidden from the children. Tommy, the youngest, provided the most heartbreaking testimony. In his innocent way, he described how Margaret had told them that their father didn't really love them, that he'd hired her to take care of them because he was planning to abandon them permanently. She'd convinced the boys that their only hope of survival was to be completely obedient to her wishes, no matter how cruel or unreasonable those wishes might be. As Sam listened to his son's accounts, a picture began to emerge of a woman who'd systematically worked to destroy his family while positioning herself to gain control of his assets. The marriage had been a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to give her legal access to his property and the authority to control his children in his absence. But Margaret's plan had a fatal flaw. She'd underestimated the bond between Sam and his sons. and she'd failed to account for his early return from the cattle drive. Her cruelty had been exposed before she could complete whatever scheme she'd been working toward, and now she was in the wind with knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Sam's contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sheriff Ed Harmon stood on the porch, his weathered face grim with concern. The two men had known each other for years, and Sam could see that Ed was struggling with something difficult. The sheriff's news was disturbing, but not entirely unexpected. Margaret Carter had been found dead in her hotel room at the Grand Hotel, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Her room had been ransacked, her remaining belongings scattered, and her throat had been cut with surgical precision. The killer had taken her money and jewelry, but had left behind several items that suggested this was more than a simple robbery. Ed showed Sam a letter that had been found hidden in Margaret's corset, a communication that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Sam had unknowingly married into. The letter was from a man named Clayton Vance, a notorious outlaw and confidence man who'd been operating throughout the Arizona territory for several years. Margaret, it seemed, had been working with Vance to identify wealthy, isolated targets for elaborate theft schemes. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Margaret would marry a successful rancher or businessman, gain his trust and legal access to his assets, then systematically gather information about his wealth and business operations. When the time was right, Vance and his gang would strike, using Margaret's inside knowledge to maximize their take while minimizing their risk. Sam's case had been particularly attractive because of his frequent absences on cattle drives. Margaret would have months at a time to work without supervision, gathering intelligence and positioning herself to inherit everything if Sam were to meet with an unfortunate accident on the trail. The abuse of his sons had been both a means of control and a way to ensure they would be too traumatized to provide coherent testimony if anything went wrong. But something had gone wrong, and now Margaret was dead. The question was whether she'd been killed by her own partners to prevent her from talking or by someone else who'd discovered the conspiracy and decided to take justice into their own hands. Ed's investigation had revealed that Margaret wasn't even her real name. The woman Sam had married was actually Catherine Mills, a former actress from San Francisco who'd been involved in several similar schemes throughout California and Nevada. She'd been wanted by law enforcement in 3 states, though she'd always managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities. The sheriff's news got worse. Vance and his gang were still operating in the area, and they might not know that their inside source was dead. If they were planning to move against Sam's property, they might strike at any time, expecting Margaret to provide assistance from within the house. Sam's blood ran cold as he realized the danger his family was still in. The boys had been through enough trauma, but now they might be facing an even greater threat. Vance was known for his ruthlessness, and he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses if his plans were threatened. Ed offered to post deputies around the house, but Sam knew that wouldn't be enough. Vance was too smart and too experienced to be deterred by a few lawmen. If Sam wanted to protect his sons, he'd need to take more direct action. The two men spent the morning developing a plan. Sam would take the boys to safety at his brother's ranch 50 miles north of Tombstone, while Ed would work with federal marshals to track down Vance and his gang. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would get the children out of immediate danger while the authorities dealt with the larger threat. But as they prepared to put their plan into action, new information arrived that changed everything. A telegram from the marshal's office in Tucson revealed that Clayton Vance had been arrested 3 days earlier in connection with a bank robbery in Phoenix. He was currently in federal custody and couldn't possibly be responsible for Margaret's death or any immediate threat to Sam's family. This news raised more questions than it answered. If Vance was in jail, who had killed Margaret? And if the original conspiracy had been disrupted, why was Sam still feeling like his family was in danger? The answer came from an unexpected source. Annie Bishop, the local school teacher who'd been concerned about the Carter boys' prolonged absence from school, arrived at the house with information that shed new light on the situation. Annie was a brave woman who'd risked her reputation by investigating the boys' circumstances when she noticed they'd stopped attending classes. Annie's investigation had revealed that Margaret had been working with more than just Vance's gang. She'd also been in contact with a group of corrupt businessmen in Tombstone who were involved in land speculation and mining claim fraud. These men had been using Margaret to gather information about successful ranchers and farmers who might be forced to sell their property under the right circumstances. The plan had been to create financial pressure on targeted families through various means: cattle rustling, crop destruction, harassment by false debt collectors, until they were forced to sell their land at below-market prices. Margaret's role had been to identify the most vulnerable targets and provide inside information about their assets and weaknesses. Sam's ranch had been particularly attractive because of its strategic location near several promising mining claims. If the conspirators could force him to sell, they could acquire valuable land at a fraction of its true worth, and then profit from both the mining rights and the increased property values that would result from the town's continued growth. Margaret's death had likely been ordered by her business partners when they realized she'd been exposed and might reveal their involvement to save herself. But her death didn't end the threat to Sam's family. It might actually increase it, since the conspirators would now be desperate to eliminate any witnesses who could connect them to the failed scheme. Annie's courage in investigating the situation had provided crucial intelligence, but it had also put her in danger. The corrupt businessmen wouldn't hesitate to silence a school teacher who knew too much about their operations, especially one who'd already demonstrated her willingness to take risks to protect children. As the day wore on and more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Sam realized that his family's ordeal was far from over. The immediate threat of domestic abuse had been eliminated with Margaret's death, but they were now facing a more complex and dangerous enemy, a group of powerful men who had the resources and connections to strike from multiple directions. The lonely cowboy who'd returned home expecting to find peace and family happiness had instead uncovered a web of corruption and violence that threatened everything he held dear. But Sam Carter was not a man who backed down from a fight, especially when his children's lives were at stake. As night fell over Tombstone and the snow continued to accumulate in the streets, Sam made preparations for the battle he knew was coming. He'd failed to protect his sons from one threat, but he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The shadows of deception were deep and dangerous, but Sam Carter intended to bring them into the light, no matter what the cost. The third day after Margaret's death dawned clear and cold, with a crystalline sky that seemed to mock the darkness gathering around the Carter family. Sam had spent the previous evening fortifying his house and making contingency plans, but he knew that hiding behind barricaded doors was no long-term solution. If he wanted to protect his sons and end the threat hanging over their heads, he'd need to take the fight to his enemies. Annie Bishop arrived at the house shortly after sunrise, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. She'd spent the night at the home of Dr. Samuel Adams, one of Tombstone's most respected citizens, after receiving a threatening message that made it clear her investigation had attracted dangerous attention. The note, written in an educated hand, had warned her to stop asking questions about certain business matters if she valued her continued health and employment. But Annie's courage hadn't been diminished by the threats. If anything, the attempt to intimidate her had only strengthened her resolve to see justice done. She brought with her additional information that she'd gathered through careful questioning of other townspeople, details that helped complete the picture of the conspiracy Sam was facing. The corrupt businessmen behind the land speculation scheme were led by Victoria Lang, the wealthiest widow in Tombstone and one of the most influential people in the entire territory. Victoria owned the largest mining operation in the area, controlled significant real estate holdings, and had political connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. She was also, according to Annie's research, Margaret's real employer and the true architect of the plan to destroy Sam's family. Victoria's scheme was more sophisticated than Sam had initially realized. She hadn't simply been targeting individual ranchers for land acquisition. She'd been working to control the entire economic development of the region. By forcing out independent operators and consolidating property ownership under her control, She could manipulate mining rights, water access, and transportation routes to maximize her profits while eliminating competition. Margaret's marriage to Sam had been just one part of a larger campaign that included similar operations against other successful families in the area. Victoria had recruited several women like Margaret, attractive, intelligent criminals who could infiltrate target households and gather the intelligence needed for more complex attacks on their victims' livelihoods. The murder of Margaret had been necessary from Victoria's perspective, because the woman had become a liability. Her cruelty toward Sam's children had been excessive and had attracted unwanted attention from people like Annie Bishop. Moreover, Margaret had begun demanding a larger share of the profits from their various schemes, threatening to expose the operation if her demands weren't met. Victoria's solution had been characteristically ruthless. She'd had Margaret killed and the hotel room staged to look like a robbery, eliminating both a security risk and a financial obligation in one efficient action. But Margaret's death had created new problems, since it left Victoria without inside intelligence about Sam's plans and resources. Annie's investigation had revealed that Victoria was now planning a more direct approach. Unable to rely on subterfuge and inside information, she intended to use her political connections and financial resources to destroy Sam through legal and economic pressure. False debt claims, trumped-up criminal charges, and bureaucratic harassment would be used to force him into bankruptcy and desperation. The plan was already in motion. Sheriff Harmon had received orders from the territorial government to investigate allegations that Sam had been involved in cattle rustling during his recent drive. The charges were completely fabricated, but they would require Sam to travel to Tucson for hearings and legal proceedings, leaving his sons vulnerable and his ranch undefended. Simultaneously, Victoria's business associates were preparing to file claims against Sam's property, alleging that he owed substantial debts to various creditors throughout the territory. The claims were false, but proving their fraudulent nature would require expensive legal representation and months of court proceedings that Sam couldn't afford. Most insidiously, Victoria had arranged for Sam's sons to be placed under the supervision of territorial child welfare authorities, citing concerns about their care and education following Margaret's death. The boys would be removed from their father's custody and placed in an institution in Phoenix, ostensibly for their own protection, but actually to eliminate them as potential witnesses and to increase pressure on Sam to cooperate with Victoria's demands. The scope and sophistication of Victoria's attack was breathtaking in its cruelty and efficiency. She'd identified every aspect of Sam's life that he valued: his children, his property, his reputation, his freedom, and had developed coordinated strategies to threaten all of them simultaneously. Most men would have been overwhelmed by such an assault and would have surrendered rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. But Sam Carter was not most men. The years of hardship and loss that had shaped his character had also given him a strength and determination that Victoria had underestimated. Moreover, she'd made a crucial error in her planning. She'd assumed that Sam would face her attacks alone, without allies or resources to mount an effective defense. Annie Bishop's courage and investigative skills had provided Sam with intelligence about Victoria's plans, giving him the advantage of knowing what was coming before it arrived. Dr. Adams had offered his support and that of other respectable citizens who were disturbed by the evidence of corruption in their community. Even Sheriff Harmon, despite the pressure he was receiving from territorial authorities, had privately indicated his willingness to help Sam if the evidence of Victoria's crimes was strong enough to justify action. But Sam knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough to defeat Victoria Lang. She had too much money, too many connections, and too much experience in manipulating legal and political systems to be brought down by conventional means. If he wanted to protect his family and expose her crimes, he'd need to be as ruthless and creative as she was. The plan Sam developed was risky and required precise timing, but it offered the best chance of turning Victoria's own weapons against her. Instead of waiting for her attacks to begin, he would force her to reveal her hand prematurely by creating a situation she couldn't ignore or control. Sam's first move was to publicly announce his intention to sell his ranch and leave the territory with his sons. He made sure the announcement reached Victoria through multiple channels, including a conversation with one of her known associates at the Oriental Saloon. The news would force Victoria to accelerate her timeline since she couldn't allow Sam to escape with his assets intact. Simultaneously, Sam began liquidating his readily available assets and converting them into gold and cash that could be easily transported. He made no secret of these transactions, ensuring that Victoria's spies would report his activities and confirm that he was indeed preparing to leave Tombstone permanently. The bait was irresistible. Victoria had invested too much time and resources in her campaign against Sam to allow him to simply walk away. She would have to move quickly to seize his assets before he could escape, and that urgency would force her to take risks and make mistakes that could be exploited. Annie Bishop played a crucial role in the deception, spreading rumors throughout the community about Sam's desperation and fear. She let it be known that he was terrified of the criminal charges being prepared against him and was willing to sell his property at far below market value to raise cash for his escape. The story was believable because it was exactly what Victoria expected to hear. Dr. Adams provided legitimacy to the deception by publicly expressing concern about Sam's state of mind and the welfare of his children. He suggested that perhaps it would be best for everyone if the family did leave Tombstone, given the traumatic events they'd experienced. His support for Sam's apparent decision to flee would make Victoria more confident that her psychological warfare was succeeding. But the most important element of Sam's plan was the involvement of his sons. Eli, Ben, and Tommy had suffered terribly at Margaret's hands, but their ordeal had also made them stronger and more mature than their years would suggest. They understood that their family was still in danger, and they were willing to play their parts in the deception that might save them all. The boys' role was to appear frightened and traumatized whenever they were seen in public, reinforcing the impression that Sam was desperate to get them away from Tombstone. They practiced looking scared and withdrawn, and they made sure to flinch whenever adults approached them, as if they expected to be hurt. As word of Sam's plan spread throughout the community, Victoria's response was swift and predictable. She accelerated her legal and financial attacks, filing the fraudulent debt claims and criminal charges ahead of schedule. She also began making inquiries about purchasing Sam's property, offering prices that were insultingly low but which she expected him to accept in his desperation. But Victoria's haste led her to make the crucial mistake Sam had been hoping for. In her eagerness to seize control of his assets, she revealed the full extent of her network of corrupt associates and illegal activities. The forged documents, bribed officials, and intimidated witnesses that she deployed in her accelerated campaign provided the evidence that law enforcement needed to build a case against her. Sheriff Harmon, working with federal marshals who'd been investigating territorial corruption, was able to document Victoria's crimes as they occurred. The fraudulent debt claims were traced back to her associates, the forged documents were analyzed and proven false, and the pattern of intimidation and violence was established through testimony from multiple witnesses. As Victoria's web of deception began to unravel, Sam prepared for the final phase of his plan. He'd succeeded in forcing his enemy to reveal herself, but now he faced the most dangerous part of the operation, the moment when Victoria realized she'd been outmaneuvered and decided to cut her losses by eliminating the witnesses who could destroy her. The lonely cowboy who'd returned home to find his children in danger had become a hunter, using his enemy's own tactics against her. But the hunt was far from over, and the most perilous moments still lay ahead. The confrontation Sam had been preparing for came sooner than expected, arriving with the violence and chaos that had always marked Victoria Lang's approach to problem-solving. It began at dawn on the fourth day, when 6 armed men surrounded Sam's house while the family was still sleeping, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow that continued to fall over Tombstone like a shroud. Sam had been expecting an attack, but Victoria's timing caught him slightly off guard. He'd anticipated that she would wait until the legal proceedings were further advanced before resorting to direct violence, but her desperation had apparently overcome her usual caution. The evidence that Sheriff Harmon and the federal marshals had been gathering was threatening to expose her entire operation, and she'd decided that eliminating the Carter family was worth the risk of additional scrutiny. The leader of the attack was Jake Morrison, Victoria's most trusted enforcer and a man whose reputation for brutality was well known throughout the territory. Morrison had been with Victoria since the early days of her rise to power, and he'd eliminated numerous obstacles to her ambitions over the years. He was a professional killer who took pride in his work, and he'd been given explicit instructions to ensure that no member of the Carter family survived to testify against his employer. But Morrison had underestimated both Sam's preparedness and the loyalty of the allies he'd cultivated during his years in Tombstone. As the gunmen took their positions around the house, they found themselves facing not just one desperate father, but a coordinated defense that had been planned with military precision. Dr. Adams had positioned himself in the abandoned building across the street, armed with a rifle and a clear field of fire toward the house's front entrance. Annie Bishop had taken refuge in the schoolhouse with several other townspeople who'd volunteered to help, ready to provide covering fire if the attackers tried to escape in that direction. Even Sheriff Harmon, despite the political pressure he was facing, had quietly positioned two of his most trusted deputies in strategic locations around the neighborhood. The battle began when Morrison made the mistake of trying to force entry through the front door, apparently expecting to find the family cowering and defenseless inside. Instead, he met Sam's shotgun blast, which sent him tumbling backward into the snow with a scream of pain and rage. The sound of gunfire shattered the pre-dawn quiet, and suddenly the entire area erupted in chaos. Sam had spent the previous days turning his modest home into a fortress, reinforcing doors and windows, creating firing positions, and stockpiling ammunition. He'd also prepared multiple escape routes, knowing that he might need to evacuate his sons if the situation became untenable. The boys themselves had been trained in what to do if shooting started, and they immediately took cover in the root cellar that had once been their prison under Margaret's rule. The irony wasn't lost on Sam that the same cellar where his sons had suffered abuse was now serving as their sanctuary. But there was no time for reflection as Morrison's men began their assault in earnest, firing through windows and trying to find weak points in Sam's defenses. The attackers had expected to face a single man protecting his children, but they quickly discovered that the entire community had rallied to the Carter family's defense. Dr. Adams's rifle spoke from across the street, dropping one of Morrison's men with a precise shot to the chest. Annie Bishop and her volunteers opened fire from the schoolhouse, forcing the attackers to take cover and disrupting their coordinated assault. Morrison himself was wounded, but still dangerous, and he quickly realized that his original plan had failed. Instead of a quick elimination of witnesses, he was facing a prolonged battle against multiple opponents in an urban environment where every gunshot would attract more attention. His only hope was to complete his mission quickly and escape before reinforcements arrived. The wounded enforcer made a desperate decision to storm the house directly, leading his remaining men in a frontal assault that he hoped would overwhelm Sam's defenses through sheer aggression. It was a tactically sound decision given his limited options, but it required him to expose himself and his men to concentrated fire from multiple directions. Sam met the assault with the calm determination of a man who'd found his purpose. Every shot he fired was aimed with the precision of someone who understood that his children's lives depended on his accuracy. He moved through his house like a ghost, appearing at different windows and firing positions to keep the attackers guessing about his location and strength. The battle reached its climax when Morrison managed to break through the reinforced front door, his face twisted with pain and fury as he stumbled into Sam's home with his gun drawn. The two men faced each other across the modest living room where Sam's sons had once played, where Margaret had tormented them, where the family had tried to build a life together despite the deception and violence that surrounded them. Morrison's reputation as a killer was well-deserved, and his speed with a gun was legendary throughout the territory. But he was wounded, desperate, and facing a man who had nothing left to lose. When the final confrontation came, it was Sam's determination rather than his speed that proved decisive. The gunfight was brief but decisive. Morrison's first shot went wide, thrown off by his wounds and his desperation. Sam's response was measured and accurate, the bullet finding its target with the finality of justice long delayed. Morrison collapsed in the doorway, his reign of terror ended by a father's love and determination. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall and facing continued fire from multiple directions, chose discretion over valor. They retreated toward their horses, but found their escape route blocked by Sheriff Harmon and his deputies, who'd finally received the authorization they needed to act against Victoria's organization. The battle for the Carter house was over, but the larger war against corruption in Tombstone was just beginning. As the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended to, the full scope of Victoria Lang's criminal enterprise began to emerge through the testimony of captured associates and the evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. Victoria herself was arrested at her mansion on the outskirts of town, taken into custody as she tried to destroy documents that detailed her various illegal activities. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Forged deeds, bribery records, correspondence with known criminals, and financial documents that showed the movement of stolen money through her various business enterprises. The trials that followed would expose the depth of corruption that had infected the territorial government and business community. Victoria's network of associates included judges, politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen who'd profited from her schemes while turning a blind eye to the violence and suffering she'd caused. But for Sam Carter, the most important victory was much simpler and more personal. His sons were safe, the immediate threat to their lives had been eliminated, and they could begin the long process of healing from the trauma they'd endured. The boys had shown remarkable courage during the crisis, and their trust in their father had been restored through his willingness to fight for them. Annie Bishop's bravery in investigating the conspiracy and supporting the Carter family during their ordeal earned her the respect and gratitude of the entire community. She would continue teaching in Tombstone for many years, becoming a beloved figure who was known for her willingness to stand up for children who had no one else to protect them. Dr. Adams and the other citizens who'd risked their lives to help defend the Carter family became the nucleus of a reform movement that would clean up Tombstone's government and business community. Their courage in standing against corruption would inspire others to speak out against injustice and work for positive change in their community. Sheriff Harmon, despite the political pressure he'd faced, was vindicated by the successful prosecution of Victoria's organization. His careful documentation of evidence and his willingness to work with federal authorities had been crucial to the case's success, and he would continue serving as sheriff for many years with renewed respect from the community. As winter gave way to spring in Tombstone, the Carter family began rebuilding their lives with a foundation of truth and trust that had been forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Sam's ranch prospered under his careful management, and his sons grew into strong, confident young men who understood the value of courage and integrity. The lonely cowboy who'd returned home to find his children in danger had discovered that he wasn't alone after all. The community that had rallied to his family's defense had shown him that there were still people willing to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Years later, when people told the story of the winter when corruption was driven from Tombstone, they would remember it as a time when ordinary citizens found the courage to stand against powerful enemies. They would speak of a father's love, a teacher's bravery, a doctor's compassion, and a sheriff's integrity as the forces that had triumphed over greed and violence. But Sam Carter would always remember it more simply, as the time when he learned that coming home early to surprise his children had saved not just their lives, but their souls. The frozen discovery that had begun his ordeal had led to a warm conclusion that would sustain his family for generations to come. The shadows over Tombstone had been lifted, and the lonely cowboy had found his way home at last. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.